And I can't thank you enough for coming out. I can't thank Marianne enough for sort of setting this all up. And that was really just a creepy, long sort of introduction, but I'm honored and humbled. And thank you all for being willing to sort of, I'm right now getting the feeling like you get when you're at a conference and you have to get into an elevator that's a little too full. You know what I mean? Sort of, but that's a good thing rather than talking to two people on a Thursday night. So thank you again all for taking the time to sort of come out and jam yourself into this room to sort of hear what I might have to say, and hopefully I can make it somewhat interesting. So because it's the Ethnobotanical Garden, I'm going to try to work around to something botanical before we're done. But I'm actually going to start out with this ship's book that Marianne talked about, and you'll see hopefully what the tie-in is, and talk about this sort of twisted path, I say, but food production and distribution. So I'm actually going to do this talk in reverse. So I'm going to start with the distribution, and then we'll get around to the food, right? And then the food gets around to the plants. So that's sort of the way we're going to go. You ready? Let's rock and roll. Okay, here we go. So first off, this is a book that maybe 3 or 4 people have seen now. It's been out a couple of years, and just based on Amazon sales, is probably where it's at. Like maybe it's a book that Kalani and Lauren, I know they read a copy. Sita back there, they'd seen it. Basically, it's a UH Press book that was a back burner project of mine for many years. Where starting with my dissertation was like Marianne said on Kauai. I was working a lot with reading through all of this 19th century stuff, like late 1700s, early 1800s, sort of stuff, and reading through ship's logs and everything else. And I kept seeing the references to the vessels, the Western-style vessels that the Ali'i had acquired, right? And I'd see all these different names, and like Samuel Kamakawa would use one name, and someone else is using another name. And I'm just like, is this the same vessel? Like, what's going on? And I couldn't find any resource that pulled all that together. So I sort of treated it like a New York Times crossword puzzle and slowly tried to sort of make sense of who was referring to which vessel and by what name and all of that. And then I ended up with about 60 vessels before 1840 that I could still put names on, and at least another 40 or 50 that we don't have the names for anymore. So like easily hundreds of Western-style planked vessels that are cruising around waters out here under the hands of Ali'i. And it's like, well, what the heck are they doing with them? And so what that's going to lead back around to is this idea of food distribution, right? I'm giving you my whole sort of story in quick abstract form, that one of the big things they were doing is changing from the ahupua'a system of self-sufficiency, like where all food is sort of being grown in an area really close by, to collecting a lot of that food. And some of that food is going to other parts of the islands, which are highly populated and not growing enough food, inter-island, going between islands. And other stuff is going off to the whalers and the other things and sort of turning into this capitalist economy. And so even before the Kona field system, the structure of it changed, the use of it changed too, right, in terms of how that food was being used and what was being grown. I'm not the first one to make that realization. For instance, if you take a look back to 1992, there's a book on Honolulu Valley on the north shore of Oahu, where in fact you can see, even though that field system was, those lo'i were being sort of abandoned a lot in certain areas, then the whaling season hit again, and kaboom, they're back in production, but mostly for sort of surplus to go out to other places. So anyway, it messes with your head a little bit to realize that it's not a story of robust Kona field system, and slowly it stopped being used, and then eventually it was replaced with coffee. There's this whole complex thing going on in the middle, and I want to work around to talking about that a little bit. Okay, so that's what that book is about, and we'll start out. I'm just going to start out again with talking about vessels. And again, my pet peeves are going to come out. I can't stop giving you guys, I love talking pet peeves. I don't make friends all the time when I do it. I think we tend to portray history as sort of like Polynesian, maritime sort of culture. This is the view sort of Captain Cook getting into Ke'alakekua Bay, Kalaniʻopuʻu, and sort of the double canoe that John Weber sort of drew coming out to the Resolution and Discovery. And that idea of this tradition meets this tradition, and then they sort of like battle with each other. But it's really what ends up happening is this melding of these things, and not just from the West, but also within Hawaiian cultural tradition. And if we're really going to understand how we got from there to here, we have to understand what that process was like and what was going on. And it's not simply a story of they did this to us, and there's this whole mix of stuff going on. Here's John Mears. I'm just going to give you some quotes. He was one of these early merchants who was coming through in the 1780s, and in 1789 he already wrote that the Polynesian-style double canoes were switching their rigging. That they were starting to get jibs, things that just would not be on traditional sort of Polynesian canoes, and schooner rigging in terms of the style of how everything's are put together. In 1789. So this is really before Kamehameha has even really united the islands. You're starting to see Native Hawaiian people experimenting with their vessel forms, not going like, we have the perfect system and we are not going to ever do anything else. No culture is locked like that. And so to try to understand how people were experimenting with different things is a big part. And so not only were they modifying traditional Hawaiian canoes, they were starting to look at building planked schooners, and really early on. So Ka'iana is one of these important early chiefs who ends up sort of Kauai, and then friends with Kamehameha, and then enemies with Kamehameha, killed. All of that sort of stuff is going on. But he basically had already been sailing around the Pacific, and he got back, and he was explaining to Kamehameha that a vessel called the Northwest America had just been built up in the Pacific Northwest, out of local woods up there, and that schooner is sort of, it was a bigger schooner, but it came down to Hawaii, and Kamehameha saw that and was like, I want to do that here, right? If this can be built in north and sort of on the Northwest coast, I want to start doing the same thing here. So when Ka'iana explained to him, Kamehameha, that the manner and time that she was built, he entreated that a carpenter might be left at Hawaii to assist Ka'iana in forming such another. And indeed, so earnest were the requests of them both on this subject that it was necessary to make something of a conditional promise, at least for the present satisfaction. Like, we want to be building these ourselves, right? So it's not a matter of like these stinky Western vessels. And Kamehameha keeps this up through his entire life. So if you look through this, so I have a section in the book that's called sort of Kamehameha's Lost and Forgotten Fleet. And what I'm referring to in that section aren't the vessels that we know the names for that he got from Westerners. It's the ones that were built right here. Do you understand? And so those are the ones that we don't have a lot of names on. This is much later, but I just sort of love to throw it in. I just showed this to Marianne like a few months ago. I posted on Facebook when I saw it, but it's, you'll hear reference to Peleleu. Have you guys heard that term before? Do people know Peleleu? It's when Kamehameha started to march on his campaign across the islands, he intentionally built new kinds of canoe that were wider and bulkier than the traditional ones that were used for fishing or sort of just moving around islands. And the name for those in general is now called Peleleu. Some of them are double, some of them are single. But look at this one in 1836. Can you see how it's a two-seater, like going straight across there? It's not your typical style that you picture for everything else. And you can sort of see the nets and gear on there. It's still being used for fishing, but all these people on it. So just picture that the Hawaiian canoe is not like one model with one width and one style. And when this early 1800s started up, all sorts of experimentation was going on those. Not just schooner rigging, but the hulls themselves were sort of changing in form. Just wanted to zoom in a little tighter. There's the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. As far as the planked ones, the ones that are basically going on where you have the hulls being built out of timber, Vancouver helped build one with Kamehameha that they named the Britannia, and by the 1790s. And then there was another one that everybody's heard of called the Fair American. And the Fair American is one that was basically taken by force. The guys on board were killed, right? And then Kamehameha basically gets control of this one, the Fair American, in the early 1790s. But this guy Townsend in 1798 writes about Kamehameha has built stocks and shipyards at Kauai and at Kealakekua. He had his own shipyards there where he was building not only normal styles of canoes, but these Western kinds of vessels as well. And there was a 60-ton schooner that Townsend saw up sort of on the stocks being built in 1798. By 1803, 5 years later, you got 20 of these things, 20 that are being referred to. And if I just read that by myself, I'd be going like, nah, couldn't be. But if you go through the years, look to see what happens. 20 in 1803, this Russian guy comes through in 1804, and he counts 21. And then in 1806, this guy Amasa Delano comes in. He's got 20 again, sort of floating around 20. Then Isaac Eastlund, a few years later, he's got 25. Archibald Campbell's got up to 30 by 1809. And by 1811, this guy, Gabriel Franchère, counts 40, right? 40 of these Western-style vessels out there.
All through Kamehameha's time.
Yes. So
up till 1819.
Yeah, 1819 is when he passed away. And so all of these are basically with Kamehameha pushing this idea of becoming self-sufficient and building large vessels with large hulls. This is something that he was really after doing and learning how to do. And so here's this is Langsdorff, another Russian guy. I know my Russians really well, by the way. But Langsdorff was at the same time as Lisiansky, and here's what he wrote in his journal. Like, what holds the king's attention more than any other subject, though, is shipbuilding. Already it is said he can accurately and with true discernment spot the strengths and weaknesses in any ship's construction. All equipment and tools relating to shipbuilding he regards as particularly valuable. One cannot do better, therefore, than to use such tools as articles of trade, you know, all the carpenter's tools as articles of trade when going to Hawaii. Any sailor who is at the same time a ship's carpenter is particularly welcome there and is straightway presented with a piece of land and almost anything else that he may want. So he's trying to get the craft specialization of building these Western-style vessels right here, right? And all we ever really hear about in our sort of biased telling of indigenous history is, oh, they stole a fair American, they killed people. And then later in time, oh, they bought all these things and went into debt. Silly, naive indigenous people, right? You know, those are the stories that you hear. That's not what's going on. If you want to know maritime history in the Pacific as a whole, there was a judge in Canada whose name was F.W. Howe, and he published a series of things, a list of vessels in the maritime fur trade. And this was my go-to thing during my dissertation, to learn what all the vessels out here were that were Western vessels that the Hawaiian chiefs were picking up, and how he went out of his way to sort of note what those vessels were. But then he did something else that is equally sort of damning in my mind. As soon as that vessel went into a Native Hawaiian's hands, that's when he stopped paying any attention to it. It disappeared just like a wrecked on a reef or was destroyed in a storm and sank to the bottom of the ocean. So if you go through and sort of look at the Hawaii sort of entries, here's the Lelea bird, another one that's pretty famous as far as Western ones that Kamehameha picked up. And his last entry reports that Lelea bird was later sold to Kamehameha one. That's it. That's the end. Okay, well then what? What ended up happening then? You know, but the sale is like the end of it, right? And so here's the albatross. And on Oahu, Columbia, 1860, sold to Kamehameha for 400 piculos of sandalwood, say about $3,000. Right? That's the last entry in that book for that. If you go on to the Forester, sold to King Kamehameha and renamed the Ka'ahumanu. Last entry.
Please.
Bordeaux packet, sold to Kamehameha one and paid for in sandalwood. Last entry.
Sandalwood.
That was like the big trade item back in those days. The Columbia, sold to King Kamehameha I. Last entry. The Neo, sold to Kamehameha II in 1819. The purchase price in sandalwood, the brig was soon found to be rotten and was hauled out and repaired at Pearl River. Okay, was repaired. Then what? Don't know, right? These are big. These are big square rig vessels we're talking about, at least two-masted in all of these sorts of cases as far as these ones are getting picked up. The Thaddeus, you guys know that one? Anybody? That's the one the first missionaries got here on, right? So again, so there, once the missionaries got out here, the American owners of it sold it to Liho. There she was sold and her crew paid off. They probably made their way home again in other vessels. The skins were doubtless shipped to China. Captain Blanchard reached Boston and told him how it gets home, but doesn't say to the Thaddeus once it was left here. And this is my favorite of all. Okay, this is the Beckett, which becomes the Harrietta and some other vessels that as the name changes. But what Howie said about this one, so this is 1821, it said, it got to the islands. This came out of Salem, Massachusetts. There's a super famous shipwright there named Retire Beckett had built it. The same guy who built another super famous vessel called Cleopatra's Barge, which the chiefs also picked up. But basically, 1821, he says it was reported as sold to the king there. However, this was in error. It couldn't have been sold to the chiefs there because she was later seen trading on the northwest coast and in California in 1822 and 1823. And in company with the Lascar, both vessels were at the Hawaiian Islands between 1823. April 10th, 1824, the Beckett left Honolulu bound for the coast of California. That's what New Albion is right there. And on August 8th, she returned, having left a sealing party at Guadalupe. In 1825, the Beckett was again in California, returning to the islands in November 1825. This brig was still at Honolulu in 1826. There she seems later to have been sold to, and this is actually Kaumali'i. It's spelled wrong, but this is my favorite ali'i on Kauai right here. And it says it's sold to Kaumali'i. Her register shows her length and all that. So it says, suggesting that Kaumali'i bought this vessel in 1826. Small problem. Kaumali'i died in 1824, okay? He could not have bought this vessel in 1826 because he was already buried on Maui in 1826. I have all of the papers of sale in 1821 that have come out of the business offices in Salem, Massachusetts, with Kaumali'i's name signed to it, along with the receipts for the sandalwood that was to be paid for it, which was all paid off by 1822. The vessel was fully owned by King Kaumali'i by 1822. So here it is trading on the Pacific Northwest coast under Kaumali'i's ownership. See that? But Hawaii assumed that if it's trading outside the Hawaiian Islands, no savage would be doing that. This is what we Westerners do. We don't use our vessels to go off and do trading ventures. This was done under Kaumali'i's ownership, just like ship owners in Boston did. They didn't, John Jacob Astor didn't get on his own vessels and sail out to the Pacific to do business. He had other people do it for him, and he got a portion of the proceeds. That's what's going on here with Kaumali'i.
How about?
Totally missed, right? And 1983 is about the only text I could find that sort of talks about these vessels, but a guy named Mifflin Thomas wrote a great book called Schooner from Windward in 1983. And if you go out and you're interested in maritime history, you can find that. And it briefly mentions this period that I'm talking about, not that the vessels were being built here. And he sort of refers to this fleet of vessels that were cruising around, these 100 vessels, as the mosquito fleet, meaning they're little annoying sorts of things that sort of fly around and they're not really that significant, right? And so I still don't like some of the details of how it's couched, but it's still nice that there was something to refer to, and I appreciate his work. If you take a look at this, and we're starting to get towards food and cargo here, there is a 50-foot long, I did these to scale, right? So there's a 50-foot long double canoe in the top left. This is one of the vessels that's sort of in the normal size for the mosquito fleet, this sort of 62-foot long 86 EOS or Kauai schooner, a Tui schooner. And there's the Beckett, which we were just talking about in terms of what size it would be relative to a voyaging canoe. And there is basically one of the larger ones that King Kauikeʻole had, the Kamehameha III in this period. And so if you look at the size of those hulls, what's being opened up to the ali'i from owning and possessing these is the ability to move large amounts of people, food, and produce and other goods between islands on a very regular basis, right? So this is a major economic change that's happening underneath the ali'i. And I, through my dissertation, pictured all of this inter-island stuff all being done by those Westerners who showed up in their big vessels, right? It's like that was their range of what they were doing. I had no idea that all of this is like a ghost fleet that is out there because we just have paid no attention to it. I think the reasons we paid no attention to it are twofold. One is that on the Western side, Westerners like to be the intrepid explorers doing everything that's important, right? And on the indigenous side, there's such a focus on the traditional culture and the traditional practices and maintaining those and glorifying those in ways that they should be glorified. But the consequence sometimes is that all this other complex stuff that's going on gets forgotten and left out of the story. So neither the sovereignty, indigenous scholarship side or the Western side have been writing about these vessels. It's sort of like in this gap in that space in the middle. And to me, that is the most interesting, intriguing part of telling 19th century history is understanding that complexity rather than leaving these disparate camps and disparate interpretations in these totally separate realms, seeing how it all mixes together. You with me so far? Have I bored anybody yet? Okay. All right. So again, think about it. When you hear about the fair, there's the Fair American. If you haven't seen it, this is a Herb Kane sort of drawing of the Fair American being captured in 1790. That again gives the message of violent savages taking what isn't theirs, right? And sort of that story that's out there. And
Many of these ships still exist.
none, zero. None. So this we're talking, 200 years ago, and wood in water does not do well for that length of time, right? So absolutely none of these things still exist. I want to take you to this drawing by Louis Choris in 1817, and it shows downtown Honolulu. And with the new perspective that I've given you guys, I want you to take a new look at this image that this French, he was with the Russians again. Everybody was with the Russians, if you ask me. But Louis Georges was a French artist, and he had this incredible book, Voyage Picturesque, where he was an amazing artist. He drew lots of different scenes. I'm blocking your way the whole time. I will move over here. You're in trouble now. I know, exactly. Well, they're on the board. Wait, no. So anyway, so if you look at this right here, you can see the fort that was built in downtown Honolulu right in this era, and you can see quaint little native dark-skinned people in canoes paddling around, and in the background you can see these large vessels back here with 3 masts on them, all parked, all their rigging sorted down, and you get the sense of quaint little indigenous and powerful West, and especially with the fort there. It's like the idea of the Western takeover Honolulu. Truth bomb coming. That's one of Kalani's favorite terms. So anyway, so that's an inside joke. Truth bomb. We know what those vessels are that George drew. One is called the Makanimoku, or the Albatross. That's a King Kamehameha's vessel. And the other one is the Ka'ahumanu, or Forester. Those are owned by King Kamehameha. And so once you understand that, this entire scene, and once you understand that the fort is controlled by King Kamehameha and Kalani and other sorts of ali'i as well, and that it was built by them, then you start to understand that this is an entirely native Hawaiian scene of political power that you're looking at. And if you're a Russian artist sailing into this harbor and you're facing all of these guns pointed at your ship, and again, indigenous-owned Western vessels with lots of guns on board as well, hi, hello, can we be friendly to you? It's a very different kind of power relationship than what you perceive with your own biases about what is in this picture. Do you understand? Here you got your classic sort of Iowa corn farmer, and there you got your tobacco farmer. They're from say this is what sort of West Virginia or somewhere somewhere back east, right there, right? This is a double standard in the way that we see history that you got right there. That's American right there, isn't it? Isn't that filled with America right there? Well, both tobacco and corn are indigenous crops. So Westerners are allowed to acquire indigenous things and use them as their own without losing their sense of cultural identity. But the way we perceive Hawaiian culture is, oh, you picked up our Western-style vessels, so you're no longer Hawaiian anymore. Do you understand? There's a sense of a loss of identity once Western things start infiltrating into what had been traditional Hawaiian culture. And that is a damn double standard. Do you understand? You can't have one and not the other and be treating history on an equal realm. So I love to point that out to people, right? Those are American people, and we would never get, but we don't ever say, yeah, but you're growing an indigenous crop. You just became indigenous. That argument is made. So why do we make that in reverse? There's Cleopatra's barge. The other thing that ends up happening with these stories about political power in the 19th century is Liho purchased this barge for $80,000, right? It was a super famous, it was a yacht, basically. It was fitted up with gold fittings. It had toilets and plumbing inside. It was built for this family called the Crowning Shields back in Massachusetts. And then the head Crowning Shield died. And the company that made it was like, who can we get to buy this crazy thing? They had sailed it to Europe, and they crowds of 30,000 people a day would come out to visit the vessel. It was so famous in those days. It was the bee's knees. It was way beyond Lamborghinis or anything like that. It was there was no other vessel on the planet that equaled Cleopatra's barge. Liho bought it for $80,000, right, when they sailed it out here to the islands. And a lot of people look and they go, tisk, tisk, tisk. Liho drank a lot, by the way. Drunk king, ineffective, naive, wasting money, sending the Hawaiian kingdom into debt by getting this vessel. Double standard again, right? Everyone perceives Cleopatra's barge as nothing more than wasteful, like Hummer in a suburban driveway, right? That's sort of the way that I sort of interpret that. Do we ever do that? Oh, no, we never built a massive statue of Abraham Lincoln and spent millions of dollars and all this time to put that up. This kind of monumental purchase is one way that nation states justify power, right? If you sail in here as someone from Boston or England, and you come in and you see ali'i with these 3-masted vessels and the most opulent one in the world, immediately you're realizing that this isn't a fake nation state, it's a real nation state. And the Ali'i understood that. Yes, it costs money in order to do these things, but to say that it was simply naive and wasteful is, again, being hypocritical to what we do in our own society. Am I being too political? I hope so. These are the places that I could find that all the vessels under Hawaiian ownership sailed around the Pacific when they were in Hawaiian ownership. Just wasn't here. It's pretty much spanning a whole chunk of the Pacific, from Kamchatka, Petropavlovsk, up there to Pitcairn, over to Valparaiso. Those vessels under Hawaiian ownership went tons and tons of places. Since you're in Kona, and since you have this model in the church in Kailua, Kona, this is the Thaddeus again, that's right there at the back of the church right there. Liholiho sent that vessel after he purchased, again, the things that Howie didn't think was important to include. He sent that up to Kamchatka, where the Russians were up there with a load of salt and other things that they needed for sort of curing hides and everything, as almost like on a diplomatic mission to say, hey, we'd like to be friends. We know you guys need salt. We got tons of it. We're collecting lots of that. And one of the things, and he came back with a load of stuff, but Liholiho had asked it, among the things to ask for, he'd like to have some polar bears and some caribou, right? And in fact, when in 1821, the Thaddeus came back from Kamchatka, we have in a log of another schooner, a ship that was in harbor, the Eagle. It says right in there, Thaddeus just returned from Russian America with two reindeer and a white bear. One polar bear cruising around Honolulu in 1821. I want you to understand how diverse this world was in 1821. That's very different from this idea of this isolated, no, we're staying growing in our lo'i, we're doing all of our typical things we've done. I think Hawaiian people had a vast interest in the outside world, and they pursued it, and they were interested not only in going and visiting it, but bringing things back here. And that complicates the story of what happened in the 19th century dramatically, right?
That's good. What?
Yes.
Be important, but I think it kind of is. The vessels that they purchased or made here, were they freed like Hawaii to recruit by a mixture, or who were they greet by?
To begin with, there was a guy, Alexander Adams, who was sort of overseeing Kamehameha's fleet as a whole, like sort of like a guy who was in charge of everything over the top. But starting at an early age, everyone loved, and square rigging is totally different, right, than schooner rigging in terms of what you need to do and how you set up the rig, and what you need to do to sail it and to tack and everything else. It didn't take more than a generation for people here to get into figuring out how to do that. So Hawaiians had been leaving on Western style vessels and going off and sailing around the Pacific since the earliest, like, again, I mentioned you, Kaiana, right before 1800. He was cruising the world on these vessels. He's learning how to sail them. Some of the most important ali'i here, like Kalani Moku, he picked up his own vessels, and he was adamant when he was out there. I'm Kapena. I am the one who is going to be sailing these. And again, these are square rig things. They learned how to do it. Liholiho at an early age would work with square rig models and race them across ponds with other people. John Papa'i'i writes about this, that they were learning how to sail these things early on. So just like anybody in the Eastern U.S. learned how to crew, it happened the same way. You sign on board as an idiot who knows nothing, and after several voyages, you begin to get an idea of what you need to do, right? I keep on looking back here because I did this just for like a week or two with Kalani and Lauren back there. We sort of went off in a square-rigged vessel and found out that it wasn't seaworthy and went back to port. But that was fun. I'm not a sailor, but they are sailors. But I am one of the idiots who was on board their vessel and learning how to do it. And I didn't get there in 2 weeks, but believe me, after years at sea, it did not take many generations for them to pick how to do it. So the crews are actually mixes of Western and indigenous people. So this is there's Alexander Adams. Perfect timing for your question. This is Nai Kukui right here. Nai Kukui was known as Captain Jack. He again sort of took over as like one of the lead captains of all these vessels for a period before he ended up dying on his way back from, he died in South America after Liholiho's body and Kamamalu's body were being returned from where they died in London, right? So these were big time sailors. And so what I want to do now is, where does my information come from? This is the next part. How am I doing on time? What do I got here? I don't have my clock in front of me.
You're good.
Okay, good. If I go too long, just tell me to shut up. Levi Chamberlain is a missionary. And so where am I getting all this information from? Because again, it's not really written up in main histories. And one of the things about putting all this together, this is where basically I got dinged by my dear friend Marianne for being so sort of detail-oriented. I hear that and I immediately picture like someone who's just into details for detail's sake, right? But what I found is other detail-oriented writers who would sit there and write in their journals when people came into harbor. And Levi Chamberlain in Honolulu loved to write in what vessels were in harbor on any particular day. And I thought, well, here's a great list for Honolulu. And then, but I found out later that he was only catching some of them. Stephen Reynolds has a published journal. He's another merchant in downtown Honolulu who was doing the same thing. Vessels would come in, he'd write about them, but he clearly is mostly interested in the foreign ones that were coming in from overseas. And he wasn't really writing about the Hawaiian ones that were here that much. I found this out as I went on. And then this is sort of the awesome thing. There was a guy, I wish I had an image of him. His name is Stephen McIntosh. He was this young kid in his 20s. He came out here. He hated the missionaries, but he opened his own newspaper that he called the Sandwich Island Gazette. And he'd publish all these statements in there about how awful the missionaries were and all these details about life in downtown Honolulu as his own private newspaper. And what he had in the back of it was a whole section called Marine Intelligence, where he, unlike those last two I mentioned, basically was totally OCD, where he would write down every single vessel coming in and out, including the native Hawaiian ones. And so here we have right here the Sandwich Island schooner Iolani, and then the captain's name's Paniani is coming in from Kauai, and then sailed the schooner Iolani on 2 days later, Paniani for Ko'olau, like the north shore of Oahu right there. And then you can sort of see each of them are sort of listed in here. And this is an amazing source, at least for Honolulu, of how often these vessels were sailing in and out. I wish I had a Macintosh on Maui and another Macintosh on this island who were writing all these things, but I don't. So I know that what I have is an imperfect record of how often these vessels were sailing. But by the time I was done with people like Reynolds and the other missionaries and with Macintosh in terms of compiling what was in their journals, I came up with 2,000 voyages of these Western-style vessels between islands in this period that I could at least know what date they took off and when they came in. And so what that ends up, so let me go back to this. So after a couple of years of Macintosh doing this, he left a little note at the back of the Sandwich Island Gazette, and it said, Nota bene, that's Latin, sorry, that's what the NB stands for, Nota bene, in the future we shall keep no record of the native coasting vessels. Their frequent arrivals and departures of the small craft cruising along the islands are undoubtedly uninteresting to our readers. We dropped the notice of them. That's me. And they disappear from history completely. Do you understand? It's like this one guy was writing all this down in middle 1837. Yeah, it's too boring. It's gone. And we don't have this record anymore. And this is right when Hawaiian language newspapers are just starting, and they're mostly missionary newspapers that are starting in the early period, like 1834, around then. But basically, those didn't do the same thing. No one on those newspapers were sitting down and noting these arrivals and departures. But still, if you take these vessels, so this is one of them that was basically Kalani Moku had control of. It was first named the New York, and then it became called Pa'alua, which is a name that Kalani Moku actually went by himself, which was referring to the idea that both of his eyes are closed upon the death of Kamehameha. It's like a name of mourning that he sort of knew himself. And then later it becomes the Paku Kai, but it's the same vessel. And these are basically, in my book, the entry for the Pa'alua basically has, each line is basically a departure or an arrival at a particular port in Hawaii or wherever that's going. And so this is the part of the book that most people just go, okay, great. But it's filled with information, like where were the ali'i on any given month or day? Which island were they on? Where are they going? And what is there? So any of those details sort of come out for sort of describing what's going between islands. And in terms of the lengths of time that these vessels are in use, I sort of have this graph in there that sort of explains, there's a Fair American sort of out of use by the 1800, and that's sort of gray up there. These are the large peleleu canoes that are the dash lines, and then the black lines are brigs, sort of like a sort of square rig brigs as opposed to schooner rig vessels. And the length of the line is basically the length of time that I know that vessel was in use underneath Hawaiian hands. And that's the 60, so to speak, that I have names for, going around the islands. And there are lots of detailed accounts in some cases what's going on. And so here's from 1811, so this is early still in Kamehameha's rule, or mid Kamehameha's rule, where Gabriel Franchère, when he comes in, a French-Canadian guy, he wasn't a missionary or like a naval officer or anything, but he wrote 40 schooners being used to transport the tributes in kind paid by his vassals on the other islands. So he's basically saying the main purpose of all these 40 things that were built mostly in the Hawaiian Islands were to go between islands, bringing tribute to the ali'i, who were basically all gathered together on one island in most cases, the high-ranking ones. Now, this is something about Kamehameha's style of political rule. There were lots of different ali'i aimoku, ones who controlled districts in different parts of the islands. But once he had combined all the islands together, he didn't want the Maui ali'i aimoku hanging out on Maui when he was on the Big Island or he was in Honolulu, because they could cause trouble that way. So he liked all of the highest ranking ali'i to basically stay with him in one large sort of a group, so it's basically an entire village of incredibly high-ranking chiefs who are together. They all have support people with them, different people doing different things. So you can picture these large communities that were actually beyond what it would have been for colonial pu'u, or beyond what it would have been for Lono I Kamakahiki or Alapa'i or any of the other sorts of ali'i that were out there. By uniting all the islands together, you actually had a larger governing body that was all gathered together in one place. And the draw on food resources gets a lot harder that way. And so one way that these vessels were being used, bring the food to us, right? And so they needed big holds in order to do that, to bring that stuff in. And so he writes about that. There's this guy, Gidon La'anui, another high-ranking ali'i, but he was traveling on some of these voyages, like one in 1804 that I love. It's also, he wrote out his journal and his autobiography talking about being on these vessels while they're collecting this tribute from different places, Maui and Molokai. And at that point, Kamehameha was still on Oahu and sort of bringing all of this sort of stuff back there. He was about ready by 1810, 1811 to go back to this island. Here's another sort of good one that I love out here. A guy named Charles Bernard was writing about this Captain George Bailey on this vessel, the Millwood, American. So Bailey is trying to get a bunch of sandalwood out of Kamehameha. And what Kamehameha says to him is like, yeah, I'll give you this contract to get all this sandalwood. But instead of me sending my own vessels, you go over to Oahu and you bring all of the ho'okupu, all of the tribute back to me, right? You bring all of the provisions and food back. So it says right here, as part of the agreement, Kamehameha requested that the Millwood sail to Oahu carrying 50 to 60 men whom Kamehameha had assigned to collect the animal tribute on Oahu. After arriving in Honolulu, Kamehameha's tax collectors took 10 days to fill the Millwood with large rolls of kapa and bundles of dried fish, right? See that? So this is a new kind of food production and distribution system that didn't exist in the past, that is involving the use of these large holds to move provisions between islands. And start thinking about what that means for the Kona field system, the Kohala field system, and Ka'u, and all of these different sorts of places where food is out there with rapidly depleting makainana populations, right? You have all of this sort of cause from disease and everything else going down, but you still have this new sort of level of accumulating surplus in large quantities. And it wasn't just to feed the ali'i, it was also to provision all of these foreign vessels that are coming in, right? Which is still being controlled directly through Kamehameha until he died, right? So here's from May 1820, the Journal of Sandwich Island Mission, the Laholile, Columbia, its first name, sails to Honolulu for Hawaii Island for provisions. The recently arrived missionaries wrote that small cargoes of provisions frequently go from this island, Oahu, consisting of taro, poi, fish, hogs, logs on these native vessels, right? And then 1823, a few years later, this is the Makauwahi'e, or the Waverly, to start out with, making multiple trips to deliver provisions from Kauai to Honolulu. This is right after the big rebellion over there. And so Kauai is sort of getting drained of resources coming back to Honolulu after that battle was over in 1824. The Paki'i Astor arrives in the northwest Lahaina with Captain Kahiole right on board. And I love this one. Takes a boat ashore at Lahaina, deeply laden with fresh fish caught in the great pond of Waiakea. That's Hilo. Right? Do you understand the fish ponds in downtown Hilo? So this isn't even dried fish. This is like cleaning out Waiakea fish pond, and some ali'i says, all that's going to Maui, right? and goes over there to feed the ali'i on Maui. So the food movement is very, very different in the middle 19th century. This is the Kamehameha right here, carved on a sperm tooth whale. This is coming out of Salem, Massachusetts. The drawing itself, the scrimshaw. Kamehameha arrives in Honolulu from Molokai in company with the Inore, which is also owned by King Kauikeʻole. It has Kauikeʻole, Boki, and Liliha on board, and they're landing with all these hogs and fish and kapa and sandalwood as they go between islands, right? So this is from the mid-1830s right here, 1836, and this is from a vessel La Bonite. And I love this drawing just because we don't have a lot of what these native vessels looked like. And I'm pretty convinced that this one right here, right there, is the Beckett, right, which was in use for a very long period of time. And this is basically the pier in downtown Honolulu. The Henrietta Beckett sails from Honolulu for Kauai in Niihau to collect shipping provisions, including 100 barrels of yams, potatoes, hogs, and goats. So all of this food is now moving all over the place. Lucy Thurston, our local sort of first missionary woman over here. Lucy Thurston, Kailua Kona, along the coast for 2 miles back, it's sterile. This is what she's writing about, the whole Kona field system. But there is a belt that is very rich, about a mile wide at the foot of the mountain, which is dotted here and there with kukui, breadfruit, and orange, right? See that? This is 1825, all splendid trees of smaller growth, pineapple, sugarcane, arrowroot, taro, and potatoes. And so I'm just introducing that to start to point out that what's being grown in the Kona field system is pretty rapidly changing, just the way that the maritime traditions are changing. What people are choosing to grow doesn't all stay the same. Even though arrowroot is a Polynesian indigenous crop, it was also being used big time by the sailors as a medicine, right? So they were sending out barrels of that stuff to leave the islands. And so the pineapple and the orange came in with George Vancouver in 1792. Did really well on the North Shore of Kauai, and it did pretty well in Kona as well. And sailors loved oranges, right? Keep away scurvy and all that sort of stuff. Oh, sorry, I missed one. Sorry about that. Frederick Bennett, also in the mid-1830s. This is from Oahu, but what I like about it is this guy was totally hung up on plants. He was an Amy Greenwell predecessor, right? Someone who really wanted to know about plants. And so here's what he's writing in 1834 is available around on Oahu. Tomatas, right, which is tomatoes. You can figure that one out. Anybody know what garavances are? Chickpeas. Those are chickpeas. Right down there. Chilies, American squash, muskmelons, watermelons, and pumpkins. Oranges are scarce and chiefly imported from the island of Kauai, where that fruit is produced in greater abundance. Guava shrub thrives well on this soil, but it is not inclined to propagate with the same celerity as in the Society Islands, right? So it's already here. Its fruit is never eaten. These islanders have a great aversion to its odor. Yo tambien, right? I don't like what, I don't know what it is, but so be it. So let's see. Pineapples grow wild on the soil. The eatable berries of passion fruit are there. Pawpaws, which are that's papaya. Yeah. Right. It's all good. So pawpaws are papaya right there. Already papayas all over the place. And then custard apples, cacao, grapes, figs, prickly pears. All of these things are relatively recent introductions, and they're changing what's growing in all of the agricultural systems.
Forestry on the side of this.
Yep, for sure.
For instance.
Yep, and they have a long history back to 1792, and so there are various ports that are really commonly referred to in all the journals in terms of where things are coming from. So this island, pretty much, Kealakekua, was a major provisioning stop on this island, as well as Kailua Kona and Kauai High. Not so much Hilo, believe it or not, at least not in the ones that I was seeing. They would certainly stop in there. And then Hana and Wailuku and Lahaina on Maui in this early period, and Kulu'aha and Kaunakakai on Molokai, and the Waikiki, Honolulu, Ewa, Waianae, Wailua and Waimea, and then Koloa, Liwe, Wailua, Waioli, and were all big places on Kauai. You can see where the most common places to stop in to get stuff was and where they were coming from. Anyway, that is just an attempt to take this sort of image, these images. So you get 1830s and another one of the Honolulu Pier. And when you see those Western style vessels, stop thinking of them as just Western owned vessels, right? And start seeing them as part of this very changed nature of Hawaiian culture. And that's my big message to you guys, that things are complex and changing. Okay, I'm done. Yeah. Go ahead.
With these vessels, Hawaiian vessels traveling all over the Pacific, are they part of the problem of invasive species to the islands?
I doubt that somehow there was some superpower that they had to sort of keep invasive species out. That were just on Western style vessels. But the main point to make is that, and another thing to say is, one of the reasons that those vessels went everywhere wasn't that the elite were constantly on them going to these places. They weren't. They were just using them as a way to get income coming into the monarchy, where other groups, lots of times there were American captains who were chartering them because they didn't have a good vessel to go do what they wanted to do. And then so they're like, okay, we're going to charter this out to you, and you're going to pay us this much of your profits, just like, sort of early rent a boat, right? In order to go places. But they had the capacity to do that. And they were aware enough of what capitalism was like that they didn't want to be at the very bottom of the rung, constantly being abused by Westerners who were in control of modes of transportation and the market itself. All of these things were integrated and mixed together.
Yeah. I was just wondering if that Charles Bernard that you mentioned is the same one who was stranded in the Paulfin.
It is. Same exact guy. Amazing book. And if you read far enough through the stranding, and he basically gets on board the Millwood and he comes out to Hawaii, he has lots of amazing things in that book about this. One of the things is Kamehameha was having people come over from Oahu to pay tribute to him, and some of them were foreigners. And there were some foreigners when Bernard was here who got here, who were like, I didn't get enough stuff to give him surplus, and they came over to the Big Island to say, hi, you let me stay here and I promise you tribute. I don't have anything. And Kamehameha was taking those people and banishing them to Agrigan, or like off in the northern Marianas Islands, like on your way to Japan. And so there was a period of at least a decade where there are native Hawaiian and foreigners who weren't living up to Kamehameha's standards, and he was basically shipping them out to the other side of the Pacific. And that's another detail that comes out of Bernard's thing. But good for you for knowing that reference. Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in the role of money and all this. What was making money off of these voyages, and what were they doing with the money? Was it green being paid? So what did they do with their loss?
Right. I wish I had all those details. I think sometimes it was silver, sometimes it was in-kind payments on different sorts of things. Sometimes, just like on Western vessels, it was like a portion of the proceeds would go to different sailors for, like, if you were a whaler, you'd sign up for like 1/653rd of the profits of the voyage is basically what you would get paid. And so there was Spanish silver, which was like one of the main kinds of money that was being used out here in that era. And then other times it's going to be payments made in kind to various people. But money, and mamaki became a kind of money for a while in the 1830s. It's like, how much mamaki kapa could you get paid? And the missionaries were collecting it as a form of payment for Bibles. There were lots of different things that were used as cash, but it wasn't just like one denomination. It wasn't just like silver. There were different kinds of dollars that were coming in from different kinds of vessels, but there was a mix.
Were the farmers making money up the cross? Is that church?
No. And so basically the elite were making money off of most of this stuff. And again, it's more the system of economics that was in play before the mahele in terms of who owned what. As long as Kamehameha was alive, he controlled all trade, and all profit that was coming into the country was his profit. After he died, Ka'ahumanu, who became Kuhina Nui, passed an edict that no longer is the Ali'i Nui, the Mo'i, going to control all profit, but that the highest ranking Ali'i would basically be able to accumulate profit. And it was a messy system. Like it wasn't really clear, like if Kalani Moku could control the sandalwood cutting on this island, or if Boki could then say to Kalani Moku, hey, you cut stuff. And then Boki and Kalani Moku go, no, you cut it yourself. And so you see these battles starting to show up. And those were managed in councils that the elite would hold called ahamoku. They would basically get together in these groups and try to negotiate how it is that they're going to work stuff out. And those aha-moku councils were held on one island in one place. And when they were held, you'll see stories of like these 8 or 9 brigs, like some of the ones that we've mentioned that are under control of the chiefs, all descending on Lahaina or all descending on Honolulu so that they could hold these councils. So messy. That's all mixed in. Yeah.
How I read that a lot of Kona in this area was sandalwood, right? Sandalwood forests.
Up higher, yeah. Yeah.
So how much of that was cut down? Did it?
So sandalwood was pretty much by the 1830 the stuff which was marketable in Canada. So for those of you who don't know, sandalwood is a species that grows here. There are actually a couple of species, but it has a fragrance in the root, in the heartwood. Not so much the root, but the heartwood. And that was used for incense in China, and it was used for medicine and oil. But it was super valuable to the Chinese market, which is where most of the wealth that the British and the American traders were trying to go to was. They wanted to give something to China so that they could get porcelain and tea back. And so that is basically why they were going after sandalwood. Up until 1825, basically you needed to cut down about 133 pounds of sandalwood to earn $10. Right, so like you can sort of picture 133 pounds is about $10. That's what 133 1/3. They measured in a unit called a picule, which sort of comes out of a Russian system. But 133 1/3 pounds is 1 picule, and that was about $10 a picule is what it was worth. And it was pretty much largely cut down by 1830. There was still small amounts of it left, but that stuff wasn't really good for the market. It wasn't saleable, and they started referring to it as sticks and twigs. And then Boki figured out that stuff was down in Vanuatu and Rotuma, and he took 2 of his vessels, the Beckett, which we've already talked about right here, and the Kamehameha, filled with hundreds of Hawaiian sailors down there to go collect that wood rather than have it cut down here. So the elite started going into other parts of the Pacific to cut down more sandalwood. And again, Boki was very focused on trying to pay down debts and other things. So he had it wasn't just him being greedy. He was basically trying to make certain that the monarchy paid off its debts, something our nation should think about someday. But anyway, that was an abject failure. There was malaria. There were battles with different people, and one of the vessels was lost at sea, and only like 30 guys made it back alive. So, but that was one of the ways that sandalwood sort of expansion spread out of the islands.
How much of the sandalwood was cut down to pay for ships? So you're talking on how much to pay for other.
I've got that in the book, but one of the things to say is there's an argument that's made all the time that these ships bankrupted the nation. And if you looked, I sort of come up with a figure in the book, and I'd have to go look it up. I don't want to say it off the top of my head, but here's the main gist of what I came up with. I added up all these vessels that were purchased, and I came up with like a money amount as best as I could. Some of them I didn't have the money amount for, but I had close to it. You can sort of, based on its tonnage and everything else, what they would have paid when I don't, you can sort of stick it in to how much was going vessel was worth. And I came up with a figure, and that figure was a drop in the bucket compared to the gross national product of the Hawaiian Islands in terms of how much cash they were making, right? So that even though we constantly hear about this $120,000 debt, it's like the chiefs could have paid that off in a year and a half. Like it was not like so much that it was beyond what they were bringing in with outside sources of income from the things that they were selling and everything else. It's constantly presented as a debt which was impossible, that only naive people would come up with it. But it's ironic to be living in the time that we're living in right now and look at our national debt compared to what that national debt was, and it wasn't even close, right? So that's my best answer, but it's in the pasta. Yeah.
What's your thoughts on I will understand of the U.S. would take Hawaii, Russia, Rat, how, but couldn't we have preserved the monarchy just as a social thing, that should get the vote to give them speculate?
I'm in a foreign land, being in Kona. I don't know what all of you guys' politics are. Hilo's a different land. I'm absolutely convinced that the Hawaiian monarchy easily could have survived and been a sovereign nation to this day if we hadn't been so greedy in 1893 to 1898 as a nation. There's no doubt in my mind that put together everything that it needed to survive as a nation, that it had gained the international recognition to be a nation state, that it had the structure of government and the economy. It was just that with the Spanish-American War and the desire of the U.S. to have a Navy base out here in the Pacific, that it was sort of like, hey, we could use Greenland. It was the same. I'm sorry to go political, but that is a perfect comparison to sort of what happened back then, right? It's like we want it and we're going to take it, and we have a rationale that we think we can use to do it, and so that's what happened in 1898.
Well, I had a short-term distinction of don't worry about 6 years ago, 2020, the Commendation is that a really good celebration, the 200th anniversary, Yashmari's time. And Yolanda, who was part of their story, which picked me to be Captain Blanchard.
Oh,
So she had everything that made me look like a hell.
wonderful experience.
Of course, we know what happened in March 2020. But so everything cracks. We were going to talk to water. We talked to somebody made a like Kamehameha.
Yeah.
Still in the and that was quite a one affair. I would have been happy.
It would have been fun. And I would just like to encourage everybody in this room to stop picturing history as two camps, an indigenous camp and a Western camp. And what I want everyone to realize is that even when ignorant people who know nothing about Hawaii, like Charles Bernard, stop in for a week, it's a really valuable sort of thing to read to understand what's going on at that point in time. It's really nicely time-stamped, right? It's not like some general vague idea of when something happened. You know exactly when he was here, and now all you've got to do is read what he says, strip off any sort of ethnocentric racism, and try to get to the details that are going down, and you might still learn something valuable. If you are a Western scholar, don't avoid stuff that's written in Olelo, Hawaii, right? You know, these Hawaiian language newspapers are filled really amazing. Like the story of Gidgen La'anui is all in Hawaiian, and you got to read that to understand what's going on in these things. So I just wish we could get to the point where we could sort of stop sort of raising up one kind of historical text and denigrating another, and just sort of get them all together, analyze the biases, and then tell a more complete story. And I think we'll do a better job of understanding what colonialism is and how we got from 1777 to 2026. I think once you do this, you can see yourself so much better. Like you can understand that there are connections. I think I might be the first Mills from my family that's out here, but out in the fields of Lalamilo is a kind of ceramic that my great-great-grandparents were making in Trenton, New Jersey, a kind of yellowware that was like specific to that area, and it's on the ground out there. And I go out to Lalamilo with a Paniolo, and I see that little yellow ceramic on the ground. I'm like, my great-great-grandmother could have made that, right? Do you understand? It's like, you know, there's all these connections back and forth once you stop separating things into different camps. Yeah.
We're doing your research. You talked a little bit about using some of the newspapers and on the Hawaii.
Yep.
So is that something that you...
Absolutely. So I've been here for 29 years. I came in, I've been at UH Hilo for 29 years. I started in like 36 years ago, like when I met Marianne. And when I got here to begin with, and I had no keiki, and I was living on Laupāhoehoe, I took Olelo Hawaii 5 days a week when I first got here. And I've listened to, as the years have gone by and the daughter shows up and I can't do Olelo Hawaii anymore, I basically turn on the DVD in my car and try to do sort of listening things. But I have an awful brain for speaking. I get panicked right away as soon as I start to speak. My vocabulary is pretty good. So like I can go into Ulukau and I can look through the Nupepa sections and I can search for the words like kapena and moku, right, next to each other. Like moku means lots of things in Hawaiian. Moku is like an island. Moku is a district, but moku is also a ship. And if the word moku is next to the word kapena, then I can go, and sure enough, it was a great way to find references to ships and captains, like right next to each other. And then a lot of those were there. And then I'd work on translating. And where I get stuck, I'd ask my friends, and all of that works out. So I didn't want to avoid it, but I can't claim that I am like totally ma'a and like completely into speaking Olelo Hawaii, but I can still use it. And the tools are there to pretty much figure out how.
So do you think that you would search through all of the newspapers so far to find what this?
Well, I think I've looked good. So here's the thing. So I think, starting with what is up and scanned, right? I've like sort of using Public Hilo and Ulukau and the Nupepa database for what has been scanned. I think I've done a pretty good job of finding the references to these vessels, and I haven't found a single story that is just about these kinds of vessels that was written in the 1850s or 1860s. It wasn't what people were focused on, and so again, there's a hole there, right? That it's like, well, if I don't see it in Nupepa, Hawaii, then it must not have been there. It is. It's just there's so many things that happen in history that aren't the focus of the people who are writing, or other things that are more important, and they wrote about other things, right? That's my best answer.
Photography came in around 1846 or so. How many pictures do we have that would be sure they have?
So 1840 is the Constitution, and that was my sort of cutoff point. And I miss telling stories of some awesome vessels. Like there's one, the Kamehameha III, which is an awesome story, but it shows up just after 1840. And like, I want to keep on going, but it really starts to get messy. And in terms of having so many schooners in Hawaiian waters, some of which are foreign owned and some of which are Hawaiian owned, and some of which are Hawaiian privately owned as compared to Hawaiian government owned. And it turns into a larger quagmire. I don't know if I'm going to take that one on, but there's plenty of stuff for other people to focus on, to learn more. Yeah. Good.
Out, and so we can have a big round of.
Thank you, Malo. Thank you for listening for so long.
Questions, we make sure you get some sustenance and can
get some circulation back in your butts. Get up and ask me questions out of your chairs. Come talk. Okay.
I'm a trade expert, so the cure cup that's foundation.